It is regarded as the most terrifying icon of German wartime propaganda, yet behind this facade of invincibility lies a dossier riddled with technical humiliations and strategic dementia. Why did the very first secret mission of this supposed marvel end not in triumph, but as an embarrassing gift to the enemy in the middle of a Russian swamp? We reveal how a world-renowned constructor nearly set his own prototype ablaze before the eyes of the entire High Command, and why this steel colossus made the lives of its own soldiers more hellish than it ever saved them. Discover the truth about engines that swallowed 480 litres of fuel while the front was collapsing, and a bizarre, fraudulent transaction with Japan, where there were serious plans to ship a 57-ton tank aboard a submarine. This is not a heroic epic, but the protocol of an engineering frenzy that proves a war cannot be won by sheer gigantomania alone. Stay with us for the anatomy of a steel failure. At the twilight of the 1930s, the German armaments industry found itself ensnared in a profound strategic dilemma, as the very concept of a heavy tank was, for all intents and purposes, absent from the Wehrmacht's doctrinal registers. The High Command, intoxicated by the lightning-fast triumphs of the early campaigns, had staked the nation's entire destiny on the blitzkrieg tactic, a doctrine where the armoured vehicle was envisioned as a nimble, predatory spearhead. In this grand ballet of rapid manoeuvres, any additional tons of steel were perceived as a useless ballast, a pathological hindrance that would only stall the relentless momentum of the motorised divisions. There existed an arrogant conviction among the strategists that their medium tanks, designed for fluid manoeuvring and encirclement, would be more than sufficient to break any opponent on the European continent. However, this doctrinal blindness was to be brutally corrected by the harsh reality of the Eastern Front, transforming the generals' theoretical war games into a bloody awakening. With the onset of hostilities in the Soviet Union, German tankers were suddenly confronted with a technological reality that was conspicuously absent from their manuals: the appearance of the T-34 and the KV-1 heavy tank. The vaunted pride of the Panzerwaffe, the Panzer III and IV, were revealed to be hopelessly incapable of piercing the shells of these new predators at standard combat ranges, their shells bouncing with a notorious impotence off the sloped steel plates of the Soviets. From this shattered sense of strategic superiority, a frantic activism was born. The Army Weapons Office hastily unearthed dusty blueprints for so-called breakthrough vehicles, or Durchbruchwagen, whose development had been hitherto neglected with utter contempt. This was the exact moment when gigantomania triumphed over logistical reason, marking the beginning of a race against the clock characterised by an improvisation that knew no equal. The firms Henschel and Porsche received an imperious mandate to forge a monster capable of not only dominating Soviet machinery, but also pulverising the most fortified defensive lines in a frontal assault. Technical requirements were incessantly revised upward, until the projected weight far exceeded the 30 tons originally envisioned. To push the irrationality of this enterprise to its paroxysm, a delivery date was dictated by purely political and propagandistic motives: the 20th of April, 1942. Two rival industrial titans thus found themselves under titanic pressure to conjure a technical marvel from the earth in a matter of months, sacrificing sound engineering on the altar of vanity and the unrealistic fantasies of the leadership. Ferdinand Porsche, who enjoyed the status of a technical favourite within the political elite, presented a concept whose technical eccentricity knew no bounds and which defied any logic of sustainability in a moribund war economy. He bet everything on a risky petro-electrical transmission, a hybrid system where two air-cooled 10-cylinder engines functioned merely as generators to feed two separate electric motors, which were finally tasked with driving the sprocket wheels. This architecture not only devoured astronomical quantities of copper, a metal of critical scarcity at the time, but in the field it proved so clumsy that the prototype tended to sink up to its hull in soft ground due to its colossal ground pressure. On the opposing side stood Henschel's chief designer, Erwin Aders, nicknamed the Father of the Tigers, who adopted a more pragmatic and traditional approach, though no less monumental, banking on a classic mechanical transmission to mobilise the required armour and firepower. When the decisive day of the demonstration arrived at the headquarters in East Prussia, the transport of these steel colossi already revealed the first logistical nightmares of this rushed project. Since both designs significantly exceeded the standard width of railcars, it was necessary to paralyse all rail traffic on the affected lines and employ special 70-ton heavy cranes just to unload them. During the trials, while the Henschel tank manoeuvred with relative agility in confined spaces, its engine overheated so severely that only forced cooling brakes prevented a wiring fire or a catastrophic failure of the engine block. Porsche's prototype, by contrast, failed miserably. Its revolutionary but immature technology became mired in the mud, and the complexity of the controls completely overwhelmed the driver's capacity. Despite the manifest shortcomings of the winner, whose power unit was already working at its thermal limit during the test run, Henschel received the contract for mass production, leaving Porsche with 90 hulls already manufactured which, in his unshakable and premature arrogance, he had ordered to be produced even before the final decision was known. To ensure this mechanical titan, which nearly doubled the weight envisioned in the original blueprints, could move at all, Chief Engineer Aders resorted to a technical solution whose hostility toward maintenance was unparalleled. He designed a labyrinthine Schachterlaufwerk, or interleaved road wheel system, where 24 road wheels overlapped in 4 rows per side to distribute the colossal ground pressure and provide a firing platform of absolute stability. While this mechanism fascinated on paper, with its surgical precision and smooth ride, it transformed into a logistical purgatory in the brutal reality of the Eastern Front. Viscous mud and snow accumulated in the narrow gaps, only to freeze rock solid overnight, turning the tank into a completely immobile block of iron by morning. The heart of the Colossus was a 12-cylinder Maybach gasoline engine, which, despite its 700 horsepower in later versions, struggled desperately to breathe life into 57 tons of live weight. The thirst of this aggregate reached astronomical proportions, devouring up to 480 litres of fuel for every 100 kilometres in difficult terrain, reducing its operational radius to a ridiculous distance that barely sufficed for deep manoeuvres. In a move of total incomprehensibility, the designers ignored the advanced sloped armour already seen on Soviet tanks, opting instead for a primitive, boxy architecture with vertical steel plates up to 100 mm thick, which increased the weight unnecessarily without maximising ballistic protection. To make steering this 57-ton block physically possible for the driver, a hydraulically assisted steering wheel was installed instead of the usual crude levers, allowing the monster to be directed with the lightness of an automobile, provided the delicate technology did not succumb under the load. Aware that almost no European bridge could support such a pathologically obese mass, engineers equipped the first 495 units with an absurdly expensive deep-wading kit, including a telescopic snorkel. Thus, the tank could, theoretically, cross rivers up to 4 meters deep by crawling along the bottom like a submarine. A perfect example of technical hypercompensation for a fundamentally flawed, overweight concept. The baptism of fire for this technological giant in September 1942 turned into a tactical debacle that mercilessly exposed the strategic myopia of the High Command. Instead of preserving these new machines for a massive, decisive blow, 4 of the first units were rushed into the impenetrable marshy terrain near the Mga railway station, southeast of Leningrad, a landscape that constituted an absolute prison of mud and peat for 57 tons of steel. Already during the approach march toward the front line, the delicate transmissions gave up the ghost one after another, and the units that did not succumb to mechanical exhaustion became hopelessly mired in the deep silt, degrading this supposed wonder weapon into a series of immobile targets for Soviet artillery before they could even fire a single effective shot. The attempt to recover these stranded colossi, or at the very least to sabotage them, was a partial failure, allowing Soviet troops to capture a nearly intact specimen. It was immediately transported for a complete technical autopsy to the Kubinka testing grounds. With this, the element of surprise, the most valuable asset of any new category of armament, was completely squandered before mass production had even reached significant numbers. Even during the massive offensive of Operation Citadel in July 1943, where the tank was supposed to cement its legend of invincibility, its presence was, from a purely statistical standpoint, negligible. Out of the thousands of German armoured vehicles thrown into the hell of Kursk, only 144 Tigers were available, representing less than 8% of the total tank strength. This glaring lack of quantity was, however, compensated by a singular psychological dynamic that went down in history as Tiger phobia. Allied soldiers reported sightings of the monster even where none existed. The ubiquitous Panzer IV, in its late version with side skirts, featured a similar boxy silhouette, leading to constant misidentifications. The real strength of the Tiger in these open steppe landscapes lay in its surgical ability to pulverize adversary vehicles like the T-34 at distances of 2 kilometers, long before the opponent could even dream of employing their own weapons effectively. Yet the true core of this terrifying reputation resided not merely in the raw mass of its steel, but in the perfect symbiosis between the 88mm KWK-36 cannon and the high-precision aiming optics manufactured by Zeiss. This technological coupling allowed experienced gunners to engage enemy targets with surgical punctuality at distances exceeding 2,000 meters. This technical dominance was nowhere manifested more dramatically than in June 1944 in Normandy, when a single crew, under the command of Michael Wittmann, redefined the boundaries of statistical probability. In the narrow streets of the French town of Villers-Bocage, Wittmann stumbled upon a column of the celebrated British 7th Armoured Division, those desert rats who had covered themselves in glory in North Africa, but who at that moment committed the fatal tactical error of pausing without any security measures. In the span of just 5 minutes, the German commander performed a demonstration of the devastating power of the heavy tank in close combat. Driving his vehicle parallel to the British column, he methodically transformed, while in full motion, each vehicle into a pile of smoking scrap metal. The 88mm shells pierced the armour of the Cromwell and Sherman tanks with chilling ease at that short distance, often entering through one flank and exiting through the other, while the British response bounced like harmless hail against the Tiger's frontal armour. Wittmann even went so far as to ram a British tank that was blocking his path, leaving behind a tableau of absolute destruction that revived for a brief instant the myth of invincibility, even though strategically it was merely a local delaying action. However, even the individual talent of an elite crew could not permanently compensate for the global material inferiority, a fact brutally confirmed in August of that same year near Falaise, where Wittmann's unit clashed with Canadian forces. It was there that the career of the most famous of the Tiger commanders came to an end. His tank, launching an attack in isolation, was caught in the crossfire of a pack of Allied Shermans, likely equipped with the potent 17-pounder cannons. 5 hits at short range sealed the fate of the crew and blasted the turret from the chassis due to the violence of the internal explosions. It was the ultimate proof that even the thickest armour offers no salvation when the adversary dominates the battlefield through numerical superiority and relentless flanking manoeuvres. With the appearance of the Soviet IS-2 heavy tank in 1944, the German Colossus faced, for the first time, an adversary that not only matched its armour thickness, but nominally surpassed it in the calibre of its primary armament. The Soviet leadership had responded to the threat by installing a massive 122mm cannon into a turret whose protection could withstand the legendary 88 at standard engagement ranges. Yet, in the direct confrontation of these titans, a fascinating asymmetrical mathematics of combat emerged, proving that brute force does not systematically guarantee victory. Because the Soviet tank utilised heavy 2-part ammunition, forcing the loader to handle the projectile and the propellant charge separately, it required up to 20 seconds to complete a firing cycle, whereas the Tiger crew, aided by unitary cartridges, could maintain a rate of 6 to 8 rounds per minute. This technical discrepancy meant that in a theoretical duel, the German machine possessed a second or even a third lethal opportunity, should the first shot miss, before the opponent was even ready to fire again. However, this tactical trump card was bought at the price of prohibitive mechanical deficiencies. The hydraulic turret traverse mechanism was so anemic that it ceased to function if the vehicle was tilted by more than 5 degrees, turning the manual aiming of the heavy gun into a Herculean task. Far more ominous than setbacks in combat was the logistical nightmare caused by the transport of these oversized machines, which exceeded the standard dimensions of European tunnels and bridges. Before every rail journey, the crew had to endure hours of back-breaking labour to remove the wide combat tracks, strip away the outer row of the complex interleaved road wheels, and fit narrow transport tracks, only to repeat this entire absurd process in reverse upon arrival at the destination. If one of these intricate engines became immobilized in the field due to a technical defect, a frequent occurrence given the overstressed components, its recovery demanded an effort bordering on madness. since no single recovery vehicle in the Wehrmacht was powerful enough to move the 57-ton steel block alone. 3 Famo heavy half-tracks often had to be hitched in tandem just to tow the inert tank. This fatal immobility led to a situation where, during the retreat phase of the war, more Tigers were blown up by their own crews than were actually destroyed by enemy fire, simply to prevent them from falling into the hands of the advancing troops. While the front lines inexorably contracted toward the borders of the Reich, and resources for such extravagant weapon systems withered away, plans were being hatched in Berlin for one of the most bizarre export attempts in military history, intended to transport this technology literally to the other side of the world. In a state of total detachment from reality, the history of this steel colossus culminated in one of the most bizarre commercial episodes of the Second World War, when the Japanese Empire expressed a formal interest in acquiring this heavy German technology. After the Japanese ambassador, General Oshima, observed the tanks in action near Leningrad, a single, fully equipped unit, complete with its ammunition load and radio sets, was sold to the Far Eastern Ally for the astronomical sum of 645,000 Reichsmarks. This represented more than double the standard cost imposed on the Wehrmacht. Yet, the logistical absurdity of this transaction far exceeded the financial greed, as there were serious plans to transport the tank in a disassembled state to Japan aboard a submarine, despite the fact that the welded armoured hull alone weighed 29 tons and would not fit through any hatch. Consequently, the already paid-for Tiger remained stranded in Bordeaux, waiting in vain for a physically impossible transit, until it was finally requisitioned by the German army in September 1944 to be consumed in the retreat battles on the Western Front. Other export efforts left no deeper mark on history, as only the Hungarian army received a handful of these machines in the summer of 1944, while 3 units briefly loaned to the Italians were immediately withdrawn following their capitulation. By the end of production, a mere 1,354 completed vehicles stood against a flood of tens of thousands of Soviet T-34s and American Shermans, underscoring the strategic futility of the entire project. Even in the peak month of productivity, April 1944, only 104 tanks left the assembly halls, a figure that, given the simultaneous losses on the fronts, was the proverbial drop in a glowing sea. The Tiger thus revealed itself as a classic example of German engineering amok, which systematically sought to solve technical problems through an excess of mass and complexity, rather than prioritizing ease of production and mechanical reliability. It was a tactical masterpiece, capable of guaranteeing local dominance in favourable defensive situations, but from a strategic perspective, it constituted a criminal waste of the most precious resources. These monsters not only failed to halt the inevitable collapse, but due to their enormous maintenance and fuel requirements, paradoxically accelerated it. The history of this tank does not conclude as a triumph of a wonder weapon, but as definitive proof that even the thickest armour and the most precise cannon are helpless against the simple but relentless mathematics of mass industrial production and the cold reality of logistics.